and hand it over to Professor Rajesh Gopakumar, who will speak a little bit about the COVIDGyan initiative. Professor Rajesh, over to you.
Thanks, Chandrakant. And welcome everyone to this third WebGyan seminar of COVIDGyan. This was started a couple of weeks ago, and we had two excellent speakers, Rob Phillips and Gagandeep Kang, speaking in this series. And today we are very happy to have Manu from Stanford giving the third talk. So this is something that we plan to do regularly. So please keep an eye out on the COVIDGyan YouTube channel or the COVIDGyan website and so on for announcements for future seminars. COVIDGyan itself is a unique institution, a pan-institutional initiative, which has brought together TIFR and all its centers, including the ones in Bangalore, like NCBS, ICTS, and elsewhere in Hyderabad, in Mumbai, and Pune. Together with the Indian Institute of Science, the India Biosciences, and a number of other partner institutions. And one of the main, the driving thought behind COVIDGyan is to bring accurate information, scientifically accurate information on the COVID crisis and related issues to the public. And for that, we both create content, we curate external content, and we try to communicate some of this in as accessible a way as possible. And this webinar series is sort of part of that general thrust. So it's been an exciting initiative. So check out our website, covid-gyan.in, and I think you'll find a lot of interesting stuff there. So now let me hand it over to Arnab. So Arnab Bhattacharya is a physicist from TIFR at the Colaba campus, and he is himself someone who does a lot of innovative tinkering and so on, and has been involved in the COVID crisis with coming up with interesting ideas on using N95 masks, etc. So there's no one better to moderate the session and introduce Manu than Arnab. So I hand it over to Arnab, who will also moderate the question answers and everything. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Rajesh. It's a pleasure and honor to be able to introduce Manu Prakash for today's webinar. As Manu Prakash is a professor of bioengineering at Stanford University, but most of us have probably heard of him thanks to this little wonderful device called the Foldscope. And the Foldscope is one of his actually many efforts in inventing and sort of distributing tools that sort of democratize access to science across the world. And he's one person who has really made this term frugal science come alive in everywhere across the world. And it's not just the Foldscope. Today, his lab has taken this idea of frugal science ahead to various things, diagnostics for diseases like malaria, bringing together sort of a global citizen science movement to tackle environmental problems. These could range from how do you have mosquito surveillance in regions across the world? If you're on the oceans, plankton, very important today. How do you do plankton surveillance across the oceans? So all this in the area of frugal science. Of course, Manu has a very active research group at Stanford, which does stuff which is equally cool, looking at what I guess would be how computation can be embodied in different biological systems, and looking at how complex behavior arises in multicellular organisms, for example. But today, in the midst of this COVID crisis, Manu has actually chosen an extremely apt topic of how innovation happens in times such as these. And I think rather than me speak it, we should hear him out. So we look forward to an exciting webinar, Manu, and over to you. And please do remember, please do type out your questions on the Q&A, and we'll take it from there. And I'll ask them to Manu at the end of the talk. So over to you.
May I just say something, a bunch of notifications. So to all the people in the webinar, I'm just providing the updated YouTube link. If you have friends who are watching, please share the YouTube live stream link with them. We've had to change the YouTube channel at the last minute because of some technical issues. And secondly, Pavitra will be moderating the YouTube stream. So everyone who is listening on YouTube, please type your questions there in the comments and we will pass them over into the Q&A box in the Zoom webinar. Thanks a lot. Sorry for the interruption. Over to you, Manu.
So I'll just put this on Twitter as well. I'll put the new YouTube link on Twitter.
Yes, please do. Thank you.
And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you confirm if you can all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Arnab, for such kind words. These are strange times, but we all find ourselves online together. And the fact that this COVIDGyan as a web forum actually exists with so many institutions coming together, it's just absolutely joyful to see. I've watched it from the sidelines, I mean, I think just globally what's happening is incredible, even if we are in time of crisis. I'm going to try to be quick, trying to share a little bit both on a philosophical front and some technical work that we've been doing for the last, it feels like almost a year, but since March 1st. And in the end, what I would really love is to really be able to get feedback, engage, and possibly bring many of these ideas into different spheres of lives that many of you might be involved in. So I think the apt way to begin is this cartoon that a colleague of mine shared with me from a French cartoonist. I want to begin from a positive note because in crisis sometimes we often have a hard challenge in trying to grapple the little bits of things that move along. This is a cartoon created by a cartoonist named Pick, depicting one of the postdoc students that's been really incredible in part of the work that's happening. I think much of what I'll describe is also how simple ideas can be globally adopted. And this was an example of what happened in France, where an idea that we had been working on in our lab got picked up and really scaled up across the country of France. But before I do any of that, I think it's apt to begin by really just mentioning that I am only a conduit to sharing this work with all of you. This work belongs to an incredible group of just students in my lab that have literally dropped everything that they were doing on their PhD work and otherwise to focus on COVID, primarily because we felt an urgent need to act. And I think I'll talk quite a lot about that, how this urgency is not going away anywhere, unfortunately. This is the first time I've worked with places and people around the world that I have never met. It's just really been a global movement of engaging in ideas and bringing them to life. None of these are purely academic exercises, although our viewpoint has been it's incredibly important to bring rigorous science to the table for all the ideas, but we are always looking at only working on things that we can scale up. And this is the harsh reality of the current times. So let me begin by the title that I chose, and maybe many of you know these stories. It literally begins with the invention of the bicycle itself. One of the perspectives in crisis, and often enough, we get pinched in different ways of thinking or forced in different ways of thinking when a crisis begins. This was the example of the 1815 eruption of the Mount Tambora, which led to a famine across the world where horses could not be fed, which led to Karl Dreis in Germany thinking about a human-powered running machine, which eventually became the bicycle. And even though that machine did not help in the crisis per se at that time of 1815, it really did lead to a revolution in human transportation. And I think I want to start with this as an analogy because as we think about the healthcare infrastructure in the world, none of us would have imagined we would be here. This crisis not only shows the challenges that we have and how we deliver healthcare around the world, but also what is to come. This is not the first time something like this will happen. And one of the things that we have to take away from it is both the short term and the long term. And so some things, as all of you are thinking about how to engage or are already engaged, I really want you to put the horizon, not just on the immediate, but what comes next in the couple, almost 5 year to 10 years time scale. So let's begin with the crisis at hand. All of you might have had almost a COVID fatigue at this point, with so much being thrown at us from the news. And the reality of it is it's almost a whack-a-mole type of a strategy that the world has applied as the crisis moves across the borders. How do we really think about grappling global strategies, about tackling what has worked in one place, what could actually work in other places? And then very specifically, what I'll talk about is, as we are thinking about solutions, how do you really share solutions across the world freely? Which is incredibly important in this case, because we really just have to have best ideas rise to the table and be deployed globally. One perspective of this, which I really enjoyed thinking about from an intellectual perspective, was something that was shared with me by a colleague of mine, Dr. Ashley. She's in Bangladesh right now. And she shared this context of the infamous Diamond Princess cruise ship, where the density of people was roughly around 25,000 people per square kilometers. And if you look in the heart of Dhaka or many places around the world with high density population, which could go all the way up to 50,000 people per square kilometer, you're talking about a challenge where the most common tool that has actually worked of social distancing might not be applicable or effective in a manner that it has been in previous locations. This is something that I want you to keep in mind as we think about the global context of as this pandemic is moving forward. Another way to look at this is when we think about essential markets, essential needs of people. Food is, of course, an essential need. This is a market in Nairobi when the lockdown had been put in place. And the reality is that much of the food supply comes through these informal markets that are created around the world that just cannot be shut down. And the harsh reality that exposure will be one of the cases that we have to think about. And I think this is a challenge that all of us have to grapple with very little solutions at hand right now. Another context of looking at this could be the way sometimes reactionary work, this is again another picture from Bangladesh, could lead to exposures, and I don't have to give you examples of all of this. This has happened around the world. Well-intentioned interventions can also actually lead to challenges that were not planned for. And I think the challenge that every official faces in this crisis without the sets of tools that we can think about, and this is where I strongly believe that there is a massive need for a new era of tools to be implemented, is the reality of people's livelihood compared to the risks of contracting the virus. And this is almost preaching to the choir, but just I think often enough from our vantage point in the act of finding solutions, lockdowns and other things provide us some time, but all they do is provide us some time. They cannot be the true solutions. And this is why all the work that's happening across India in being able to develop drugs and vaccines is almost essential in every regard for the rest of the world as well. And then the last kind of a philosophical note before I jump into talking about some technical parts are, it worries me quite a lot of how the world will grapple. All other parasites are not going to sleep. As our healthcare infrastructure around the world starts to shake, I've been looking at data from Zambia and several parts of the world where almost some essential healthcare cannot be delivered because of the lockdown perspective. This is a lesson from Ebola itself, how Ebola essentially obstructed malaria control, but also just the rise of cases of malaria. I'm extremely worried about the supply chain for malaria, for example, has been significantly interrupted. And in a month's time, we're going to see extreme shortages associated with malaria diagnostics. And I think, this is just one example of many things that are being interrupted in traditional healthcare, especially places where healthcare infrastructure is weak. So as you are thinking about COVID, keep your eye on the other sets of diseases that will actually rise, especially infectious diseases. It's an incredibly important, and we should be thinking of them in a collective manner. Finally, one of the perspectives that at least we have taken is thinking about protecting the healthcare workers is an incredibly important task. And I think one thing that this crisis has taught us is this idea of how both incredibly dangerous the life of a healthcare worker directly is, and especially how do you really bring information around the world for places where they had never had such infectious respiratory disease-based contexts. Because one of the things that we have seen over and over again is the extremely high burden on healthcare workers. And this, in the harsh reality of the fact where healthcare workers are really limited in many low-income and middle-income countries, implies almost a shutdown of any healthcare delivery. What's been happening in Egypt, for example, and of course, the example of hospitals in Peru is very worrisome, both not for the short term, but also for the long term. So any solutions to be thought about in the context of protecting the healthcare workers will really enable this workforce to actually work as efficiently as they can. So this is my doom and gloom slide. I'll try to transition to what we've actually been doing in this crisis, but I wanted to share this perspective with you primarily because of just this COVID fatigue and a call to action for literally everybody who's listening. This is an incredibly important time for all of you to engage, howsoever small or large a contribution that you end up making. I see this crisis as an iceberg. We have seen the tip of the iceberg so far. The long-term strategies on mitigating COVID will truly define how we bring about a new world order in terms of healthcare. On the right, what you can see is the reality of what's happening in Peru currently, where literally oxygen supply is out, there are no beds left, and many patients are being treated just outdoors, which again leads to further infections in the community as well. And more philosophically, I think we were not prepared. That's sort of an understatement. But one of the things that we've been thinking about is, of course, the sets of technologies that allows us to take proactive action. Much of the information technology comes into play in this. Much of this is being developed right now. Thinking a little bit about how do you make sure that there are new mechanisms for technology transfer, especially in the context of an equitable access for critical care medical equipment. The open source hardware movement has been incredibly important in this. The open source licenses have been important, but thinking about governments to engage in the context of evaluating technologies rapidly to bring them across the world where we really do dissolve the borders. We've been focusing quite a lot on thoughts around distributed manufacturing to not only just bring technologies, but the means to those technologies to countries around the world, which would need them over long periods of time. And of course, the pinnacle piece being COVIDGyan and entities like that itself, which is how do you really communicate much of this to the broadest groups of people? And I think, I've deeply been engaged in that process, and I've found that fulfilling to just myself. It's not just a one-way street. You know, I've enjoyed the chai and wai in Bangalore and the acts around this. The fact that as scientists, we have so much to gain when we put ourselves in front lines of science communication. So that's another philosophical note. And I know many of you are engaged in all of these practices, but I just want to emphasize the reality of why we need some of this. So at this point, I'm going to transition and give you some case studies of 4 examples of things that we've been working with, where we've been able to, in some of them, actually scale at a national level. And that has taught us some lessons that I want to share of how do you take ideas to implementation in a short time scale in a crisis mode, and use that as a springboard to be thinking about what comes long term. So I'll briefly describe our efforts in developing a low-cost open source ventilator, but a fully functional ventilator. We call it Pufferfish. I'll describe some of our work on 2 pieces of work focused on PPEs, which we call New Mask and Project 1000 by 1000. And in the very end, I want to end with much more of an organizational effort that we put around decontamination effort that Arnab and many of you are actually part of, that has allowed us to give a global and a large scale view on technologies that have existed but have not found their way in implementation strategies. Much of what I'm talking about is publicly available on our lab's website, and then some of it is also documented in archive papers. So let's begin on ventilation. And one of the challenges that some of you have probably heard in the news is, of course, just hundreds of these designs of ventilators that came online when the challenge for ventilators and the shortage became clear. One way of looking at this is you can think about, you know, say, for example, Bangladesh, roughly there is 1 ventilator per 340,000 people. That's a staggering number. I mean, you know, in India, that shortage has also been noted. Of course, there was a shortage in the US itself. We just barely, for the first wave, essentially avoided the ventilator shortage. And again, it's not the solution to this crisis, but in the lack of anything else, this has been the frontline tool. One of the things that happened in the design space where there were lots of designs that were deployed and proposed and also went through the EUA process, but many of them are just temporary transition ventilators. These are automated ambu-bags that you cannot use to support a patient over long periods of time, say 2 to 3 weeks. That's when you really do need full-featured ventilators. Otherwise, there's a lot of issues with barotrauma. And one of the things that happened is, of course, there was a movement of getting many of these out the door, while the efforts on being able to build full-featured ventilators has been much slower because of the harder challenge. So I think what we've been focused on is trying to build a ventilator that has the capacity to do both volume and pressure control in assist modes and the classic modes that you would see, but is easy enough to assemble and does not depend on a critical medical supplies. We call this Pufferfish for lack of a better name. This is a collaboration between University of Utah, my lab, and Brown University with several industrial partners, both in the US and actually in India. And one of the perspectives of this work is to crucially design a ventilator that does not depend on the medical supply. So we don't have a shortage of ventilators, we have a shortage of medically approved parts that go in a ventilator because many of them are already spoken for. And of course, the challenge is to really build this at a cost. And so the current bill of materials for Pufferfish is around $500. So this is the collaboration. And one of the things that I absolutely love about what we were able to do with Pufferfish, both in its development right now, is to, of course, make it a CERN open hardware license so anybody can build it, but choose teams across all continents. So we chose a team at Bharat Forge, which is an industrial partner in India with the fantastic manufacturing capacity. We chose a team in Chile. We've just chosen a team in Nairobi, Kenya. Again, many industrial partners that have the capacity to manufacture these units at local scale. While we do our reference design work to get this kind of an instrument approved with EUA at FDA, actually start the process for regulatory control across the world with entities locally taking ownership of development and deployment and regulatory aspects locally. So that's been both a challenge, but really a joy in some sense. And again, this is a large-scale collaborative effort with clinical groups across the country. So one of the things that I'll just describe is what goes into inventing something like this. And again, it is not about coming up with a completely new way of providing ventilation, but it is about building ventilators with completely new parts. When we started thinking about this, we clearly looked at other supply chains, and we zoned in on coffee machines and automotive parts. So the key reference parts that are used in this ventilator are actually solenoid valves from automated coffee machines and the motors that are used to move your car seats and your headlights in your car. There is a set of specifications that we chose talking to regulatory bodies and clinicians across the world. And again, this is a design that's really focused on an invasive ventilation mode. There is another reference design that we are working with a few sets of partners on a non-invasive mode, which is another big challenge for larger scale places where invasive modes of ventilation might just not be possible because just the capacity to intubate patients might not be there. So I'm just going to give you a very look of what it looks like on a table. So this is on the optics table in my lab. And what you can see in the red box there is essentially a test lung with the sets of parts on the left. These are the pinch valves made with these automotive controllers. It's a breathing circuit with both inhalation and exhalation circuits. You can see the waveforms on the right. And currently it has the capacity to do almost all of the classical modes. We are at a pace right now where we are testing this setup with simulated lungs, the ASL machines. But the other reason we were able to do this quite rapidly was, in an ironic sense, the instrument actually utilizes many of our drivers that we had been building for malaria diagnostics. So sometimes in the context of shortage of time, you really have to rip parts together from other instruments that we had been working on. At this point, we have the capacity to build 1,000 of these, and we are starting to share a kit with serious groups around the world that are interested in using this reference design. There is a modularity associated with this where there's certain sets of critical components that might not be available could be swapped, and we are documenting that. Much of this is archived in the meta-archive paper where we can demonstrate the sets of capacity that's needed, including being able to adjust the PEEP, adjust the tidal volumes, being able to run this in multiple sets of modes. And I'm not going to go into the details of this respiratory circuit. I do want to show one component out of this, which is this pinch valve. So the mechanism that we ended up choosing for something like this was a pinching mechanism from a linear actuator that's used in cars. And one of the challenges that we face is how do you really do testing on these individual parts to a scale that they could be medically approved? And so we literally build test jigs for these, for hundreds of these actuators, for 1 million cycle to really be able to show what would be the lifetime for these novel parts that have been approved in other industries but don't have any prior data from medical context. And that has led for us to really be able to document the efficacy of these actuators. But more interestingly, one of the things that we've been able to do, so this is just some raw data on these actuators and the capacity of being able to use these actuators over long periods of time. And much of this data exists already in a non-medical setting, but using that and building new sets of setups depending on what the regulatory bodies need to really be able to ensure that these sets of parts will survive the long-term use. And this is the modular context that I wanted to talk about, is where we have actually documented 4 to 5 different components that could be used for this exactly the same part, the inhalation valve, while different groups of people would have different choices to build and design. Of course, we have a preferred design that we know is widely available across the world. So this is all I wanted to say about Pufferfish. We are in a crazy assembly mode. The lab literally looks like the days that I remember when we decided to build 50,000 foldscopes in the lab. We are back in that same mode again, where literally we put together an assembly plant in the lab, where we are assembling the first sets of kits that are going out to international clinical partners that are primarily focused on starting their regulatory processes around the world, while we are ramping up with our manufacturing partners to submit the FDA EUA approvals for this device at this point. We have funding for around being able to make 300 of these, and we are hoping as a reference design to be able to build around 1,000 of these globally. So this is all I wanted to say about Pufferfish. I'll take questions in the end. I'm going to slightly go more rapidly. I realize I already consumed 22 minutes. But then any questions you have, please write them in Q&A, and then we will go through every one of them at the end of the talk. So I want to switch focus from ventilators to PPEs, which has been one of the critical issues across the world. If you just look in the US supply alone, just understanding why there is a shortage of PPEs is important. So there's roughly around 3 million practicing nurses across the US. And one of the things that it does is, as a frontline workforce, you really have to protect them. Once when we were in our peak, the surveys that were done in the US, it was a staggering number of 31% of them felt that they were not actually being provided appropriate PPE, which would be an equivalent of an N95 mask that you are given, that you have to wear and then dispose it at the end of the shift, or at the end of a single work shift. And that's the harsh reality. And this has been replicated as an example globally. And one of the perspectives that it comes down to is just the sets of decontamination processes that I'll talk about. But we started thinking about how could you alleviate this shortage on a longer time scale? And much of this boils down to supply chains for these materials. So of course, many of you might be aware of how these N95 masks works. These are, high-end materials. They are made out of fibers that could be a micron or smaller, interwoven together. They have electric charge, so they are produced in large scale. And if you look at the 3M plants that they can roughly make around 1.1 million masks per day in a centralized facility. They are planning to go up to all the way to 1.6 million, but the need just in the US alone is roughly around 3 million masks a day. And that's the harsh reality of why we cannot cope up. And then again, the global numbers, if you start asking countries around the world that are starting to see an uptick in COVID, some of them have never even had an N95 supply chain. And this is almost something that is extremely hard to get. And one of the things that we started thinking about is the goal of, could N95 masks be manufactured in a distributed manner? The goal of an N95 factory in a box. And again, this is still work in progress, but I think I am passionate about using this crisis as a way of enabling us to think about how critical supplies should be manufactured locally around the world. And this is when we started thinking about approaches to manufacture this critical material, which is this fibrous material that is manufactured using these extrusion melt blown processes. Could there be other physical processes that could be used? And I am a big fan of cotton candy. I grew up eating cotton candy. And some of you might know how cotton candy is made, but it's made through a centrifugal melt spinning process in which you take a sugar melt and you spin it between 3 to 5,000 RPM, and these liquid jets are frozen as they're flying through, generating a fibrous material. So we started asking ourselves a question: would a process like this have enough throughput to be able to manufacture, say, at a given location, 10,000 masks a day? And then if you have 100 factories around sprinkled in a country, that gives you the capacity of making and manufacturing 1 million masks per day. And we literally built 5 of these machines. We bought some of them online, and we started using different polymers. The current data is for polypropylene. And one of the things is this is literally the pictures of a cotton candy machine to the left connected with a Van de Graaff generator. And to the very right is the material that we can produce currently right away. Here is what the sheets actually look like. And maybe I might have a video for this process. And what you're going to see is the machine starts to spin, and very soon a thin sheet starts to emerge. And we're currently working on extracting these sheets and fabrics in a continuous manner. Currently, we do that in a discrete manner. But at this point, you can see this haze of a fibrous sheet that's being collected. And one of the aspects of this was to be able to show and demonstrate the functionality of these materials. We've been able to show at this point that we can make a compacted material that from a filtration perspective matches an N95 material very closely. We're still working on the breathability aspect of these materials, and that has to do with how you perform the compaction. And another way of looking at this data is, there's no good physics talk without a phase plot. So this is the phase plot of parameter space, filtration efficiency being on the y-axis and the pressure drop being on the x-axis. And you can see these are many different materials that we've been able to manufacture using this type of a process. And you can see we are skirting through the different phase spaces. And one of the aspects that I like about this as a technology is the tunability. So depending on the kind of material, filtration efficiency, and breathability that you're looking for, there is a parameter space to tune that. So this is work in progress. This is just some SEM for those sets of materials themselves. Here is a setup that we are using. The vision for this tool is to think about an N95 factory in a box that have the capacity to make filtration materials. We are currently working with our manufacturing partners to also make a mask making line that would be contiguous to this. There's a lot of work that we have done on that. And then, of course, an inline quality testing that is inbuilt in certain sets of these machines and that are automated. So these are the 3 pieces that you need to truly essentially build masks that could be accessible. And I think currently there are 10 or so groups around the world that are replicating these setups, helping us engage. One of these is a photograph or a movie that I received from a group in Israel, modifying certain sets of setups for us and helping us tune certain parameter spaces. There is, of course, in Pune, one of our engineering partners, Bharat Forge, has already replicated and is doing a machine design for this for scale-up purposes. So I'm going to quickly shift to talking about another solution that we were able to scale up much faster. So the factory, N95 factory in a box, is really a slightly longer term solution. It's going to take us some time to go through the NIOSH certification for these manufacturing machines. But the reason I'm so passionate about that approach is the goal that we have to be able to manufacture these materials locally. And then the second context is an environmental context. We've been able to show that we can use recycled plastic to make these N95 masks. And so in the future, not right away, we would like to transition into where you can only use recycled materials to make critical healthcare supplies. So the transition to the next PPE project is New Mask. This has been a global partnership, and I'll briefly describe the origin of this work. If you can go to this website called newmask.org, it describes much of this work. And this is focused on the context of using reusable PPEs instead of disposable PPEs. So there is a field of respiratory care in elastomerics that has been around for a while but has not been adopted, where there are full face shields that are used for PPEs. And we made a realization really early on in March that the capacity of utilizing a full face snorkeling mask, which is in circulation around the world, we reached out to the companies that manufacture these snorkeling masks, and they joined the coalition. And then one of the challenges was, how do you convert this snorkeling mask into a PPE solution? And that involved three different pieces: the mask itself, which provides a full face seal to the face. It combines the face shield and respiratory protection, and anesthesia machine filters that are already FDA approved for viral filtration that connect via a coupler. We partnered with several manufacturing partners, including BIC and Boston Scientific, to actually injection mold these parts. And this, once we shared this document, what happened, which was remarkable for me, was we just shared a Google Doc with our clinical and scientific validation, and it grew into a very large community, 20, 25 countries, clinicians around the world running clinical tests on this piece of technology. And that led to the deployment both in the US. At this point, we have deployed around 3,000 to 5,000 of these masks across the country. We applied for an FDA approval and got an EUA focused on deploying them as a Class 1 device. But more importantly, the same EUA was also submitted in France and got the approval from the French Health Ministry, and then now the Health Ministry in Belgium. So 25,000 of these have been deployed all across France. Around 10,000 are being deployed in Belgium. Now there is an approval process ongoing in Chile, and so around 1,000 to 5,000 of these are being deployed across Chile. And one of the things that we are starting to think about is, of course, focus a lot of our attention on Latin America right now. So there are several of these EUAs that are pending in Latin American countries and our ramp up of deploying in Latin America. I like this example because it really went from an idea to true scale up and deployment in between 3 to 4 weeks. And it is work of hundreds of people across the world, both on the clinical settings, on the manufacturing side, partnerships between academia and industry, nonprofits, literally around 30 or 40 organizations that were engaged in the process of delivering and deploying at a rapid timescale. And one of the perspectives of this is now the places that the instruments are deployed, because they are reusable, they will actually act as a barrier for the second wave that most likely will actually come. One of the things that ends up happening with this is much more of the social context of this. When you share the sets of technologies, the engagement that you have on the ground. Early on, we were only thinking about healthcare workers, but then we later on realized there is a crisis mode in both in the context of the police that's on the streets, for firefighters, for people, the EMS folks that are actually the first folks that bring patients back to the emergency room. So there are many broader use cases of sets of technologies that we had not actually realized. Currently, our goal is to deploy around 50,000 of these across the Americas, including North and South America. And I'm not going to jump into the technical aspects of this. Much of this is actually documented. And there are several configurations that you can use this. And let me just skip to this. But one of the key aspects of the role that we played as an academic lab was to really ensure that we can do both quantitative fit tests, the CO2 breathing test, and the long-term use test that were almost necessary to be able to get this in front of the FDA. So let me just skip much of this. But anyway, the joy of this really comes from supporting healthcare workers. And again, as hospitals begin to open, and this is a crisis not just for COVID, but also the survivability of many hospitals. And as hospitals are starting to implement and open up their regular procedures, there has been an increased demand for PPE, which has to be met. And so I think many of these solutions fit in that bill, where we have to be thinking about how to safely bring healthcare online, not just for COVID, but for a broader number of diseases. And again, I think I mentioned this was truly a partnership with many entities, with Boston Scientific, BIC, Decathlon, Autodesk, several partners that both supported this work financially, but also supported it logistically. So I'm gonna switch to talking about, in the last 5 minutes, about N95DECON, which is an organizational innovation in some sense, for the lack of a better word, very much like COVIDGyan. Several of us as academics, when the N95 shortage hit the country, we're starting to realize that no matter what will be put on the table technologically, it will not be enough. And we started seeing a large gap in what is known in decontamination strategies for regular N95 and what is being implemented and the help the healthcare workers and hospitals needed. So this started just with conversations across, and it became essentially 115 scientists across the country, across the board in the US, and now with international partners, including India, Bangladesh, involved, with the goal of providing scientifically validated, literature-based surveys in decontamination strategies. And I think the real joy and innovation in this space was how all of us literally put whatever, I mean, of course, people brought many different expertise to the table, but how do you organically build a nonprofit, which N95 is a nonprofit, to be able to deliver healthcare information in a crisis mode when FDA, CDC, and many organizations are swamped? So literally this group read through hundreds and hundreds of papers, digested them, documented, and we built an internal peer review system that allows us to get all of this information looked through by hundreds of scientists, and taking that information that is now technically validated and converting that into SOPs that could be directly implemented by healthcare workers, firstly focused on the US, and then later on we have been realizing across a month now of the need for something like this in LMIC settings. And so of course we have broadened the scope of this, and you will see over days and months much more information on decontamination strategies. We have broadened it not just to N95 masks, but to gowns and to the elastomeric respirators as well. And I think the joy really has been is just how the collaborative spirit across scientific communities leads to groups like this. N95DECON now is a nonprofit organization that's, might have a lifetime of its own beyond the crisis. We've been thinking about how as a group we can come through in a crisis mode to provide stopgap knowledge gaps, which many entities might not be able to fill at that time because of the crisis. So you can go to the website, you can read many of these reports. There is a lot of documented effort. To the left, what you see are these fact sheets. To the right is an example of these technical review articles that are written by the group. Of course, there are webinars that we host across the world, and we're actively engaged in trying to get this information to people that need it the most. So I'm gonna end here. I'm on the 40-minute mark on my clock. I would really love to engage and hear questions. This is a small portion of, there are several sets of things outside the scope that we are engaged in the diagnostics front, and especially the non-invasive ventilation modes. I would be very happy to take any questions. And then thank you again to take the time to listen to me. I just feel I'm just talking to a computer, so it's very hard to engage, but I'm hopeful that the rest of it can be far more interactive. So I'll stop sharing my screen and then we can do Q&A. And if needed, I can go back to sharing the screen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Manu. That was a lot of information, very exciting. And if I look at the list of questions that are pouring in, you might have to be here for much longer. I hope you've got caffeine in you. It's, Manu was woken up really early for this. So he's sitting in the west coast of the US, where it's
I have the whole day now.
Okay, so a whole bunch of questions on almost every topic you've covered, but since you ended with the collaborative effort of N95DECON, let me just start with some of those questions. So one of the things is, when you want to do something which is like this, how do you build these teams and how do you convince people to join you in such intense collaborative efforts?
Yeah, I think I wish there was a recipe. I have definitely been reflecting as a few of us who started putting this together to really think of it as a meta experiment, because it would be extremely valuable to document what happened. I think it was completely organic. The history of it, it started as just a Google Doc and a Google Drive that we had created with an undergraduate in my lab, and we just posted that, and literally suddenly that many of the groups and entities that were doing the same kind of work across the country realized that we were all trying to tackle the same question individually. And it's just the scope of this work is such that no individual groups can tackle this. And then I think the second part of this is there is no hierarchy in this group. So it's completely, I would be honored to say this, it's a completely leaderless organization. Undergraduates and postdocs and graduate students are at exactly the equal footing as academics that might have had 30, 40 years of experience, Nobel laureates that are in this group. And Arnab, you've been on some of the calls, for example, and one of the things that I value is literally, this is all new to all of us. It's much more of a learning experience. And I think shedding that layer, as long as we're passionate and we bring some process to it, we do try to bring some process to it. There are certain legal aspects of it that we were early on worried about, that we created a nonprofit to make sure that we only provide scientifically validated information. And then where we see gaps, we acted as coordinator groups for people who were running the experiments and helping people identify the big problems that exist in decontamination space. But one of the joys has been, it's just people have dedicated their time, and 3 times a week, we all get together for the main call. And it's this continuous engagement that has allowed to build trust. So there is a lot of trust in the group that when people bring something to the table, it truly is where we have had a very strong notion of declaring conflicts of interest early on, so that you can recuse yourself from a specific piece of work you might be involved in, or if you have any financial interest. So I think I would say it's just the motivation from the crisis that brings us together.
Great. And another thing which is probably across the categories, developing a prototype for something and making, maybe whether it's 5 units or 50 units in the lab, and actually scaling something up to be acceptable, for manufacturing, quality control, whatever it is. How do you see the role of, a place like your lab in sort of bridging this huge gap between a product which has to be used in a hospital setting versus a prototype developed in a lab?
Yeah, I think, that's something that I would credit Foldscope to, because we have done this before and we felt the early design decisions that we made were primarily made on manufacturability. Literally the approach of the types of masks that we would choose, the types of filters. Early on, we reached out to the filtration companies. And I think the partnership with industry has been also intellectually deeply rewarding. So, when we started working with Boston Scientific and BIC, one of the goals was to ensure how you can make a simple snap-on be airtight. And there was a massive amount of work that was done on a scientific basis first in the lab to ensure that the quality of this would be appropriate on a testing perspective. But I think the other aspect of this has also just been is completely open about our approaches. Because we were open about what we were doing, many of the industrial partners reached out to us, and there was no, there were no handshakes. It was all gentlemen's promises. They knew what we were doing. They saw the value of our work, and they felt they wanted to play a role in it. And so I think much of this happened far more rapidly than thinking about, oh, I have an IP on something, I'm going to go to the technology office, and then they're going to think about getting it scaled up. None of that actually works in this type of a time scale. Much of it was focused on ensuring that the partners that we are choosing are of the highest quality. But then on the other hand, we found individuals in these organizations that played the key bridging role between literally the person on the plant that making it to in our lab running experiments. So these are kind of industrial scientists, I would say, and unfortunately, we don't value these folks as much as we should. They are a remarkable bridge between academic endeavors and industrial implementation. And I'm proud to say I've made a few really deep friends along the way where I value their input and judgment, because they sit at the bridge and they are found everywhere. But I don't think there is a way for them to be known outside their industrial groups. And maybe beyond this crisis, we should have an entire cohort of industrial scientists. I think in applied mathematics, there has been an effort in bringing mathematicians in touch with these industrial scientists. But I mean, that's been a very joyful part. And there are equivalent partners that you can find if you dig deep enough. And I think in drug and pharma, this is a very known problem. But I think purely in manufacturing, there exists people that act as a bridge.
Okay, we have several questions on each of these ideas which you mentioned, and one, I see 4 or 5 questions on a common thing, which is on the cotton candy machine. Mm-hmm. There are a couple of questions both on the Zoom as well as from YouTube. People are sort of asking, how do you get this stuff that's being thrown out into fibers, and how do you really make a fabric out of it and make a mask out of it? I mean, could you tell us a little bit more about what's happening there?
Yeah, I wish I had including the video, but maybe I'll just talk. So what's happening is there is, once the thing is shot out, there's a batch mode of collection, and then there is a continuous mode of collection. In a continuous mode of collection, we are building essentially a belt that the material is deposited on, and it moves along the way. And one of the perspectives of this is the amount of time it takes. So I think at this point, we are at a scale where we can make enough material in a day for around 5 to 10,000 masks. And the fabric from
one cotton candy machine.
So from one cotton candy machine, I think the number is roughly around material for 5,000 masks. Yeah, and then again, the machines are pretty straightforward in terms of replicating as well. The process is that there is a process of compaction that we are currently working on. Our current methodology is a manual compaction process, because we have these sheet types processes that come in, but then of course we would like to layer them and we charge them. And that process we're now trying to automate to turn it into a continuous sheet. But the way you should think about this is, once the material is generated, it naturally evolves into these fiber-like mats that get deposited. Now they have to be layered around 3 to 4 layers of that mat-like material that's put in. And then it goes through compaction cylinders and then rolled in. And then the mask making side has been a partnership with BIC. While we were working on this machine to enable making the N95 material, we learned that BIC was already making a small mask making machine in a box. So they, in parallel, independent of us, actually built that instrument. And now we are partnering to be able to combine these two things together. And the mask making is much more of a traditional process, but what BIC has done has come up with several really clever ultrasonic welding techniques. They can make a mask every 3 seconds at this point in a small scale format. instead of the large scale format. So very small machines that would have the capacity. And I think the current work that it's focused in, which is work to be done, this is why this is work in progress, is how do you implement AI and quality control on the machines themselves? So no human intervention, because these are critical components and parameter spaces for these have to be really tuned correctly. So the current technical challenge for anybody who's interested is to make a N95 filtration measurements in less than a second or 2 seconds. So we could do that inline in a material. Currently, much of the way filtration testing is done in a batch process where you could take a certain batch. But what we would like to do is to really have an inline quality control. So that's another piece of the puzzle.
So actually, while we are on this, filtration, related question which has come in is, many times you are limited by the guidelines given by the FDA or ASTM or NIOSH or whatever else. Have you ever had to work with the regulatory organizations in times like this to actually, say that, look, let's go by common sense and not necessarily by something which has been done 50 years ago for some reason?
Yeah, I think I can see it's a trick question. One of the ways of thinking about this is, federal bodies exist to provide guidelines and provide goalposts. And I think the EUAs have been remarkable in the sense of being able to provide feedback. They have given practical feedback as well on the sets of processes. And I think the aspect of this is possibly we were not prepared for this in this context, but now going into the future, there should have been, of course, there are layers of protection. And if there were guidelines previously associated with when, this set of supply chains are completely out. I mean, I think my challenge that I face, why I still feel these are not solved problems, is the next wave that's going to hit in the broader context of the countries. Those are sets of countries where N95 supplies just cannot scale. So this is a huge challenge that we face where we are going to have to be thinking about these alternatives for a long period of time. And the current sets of guidelines have been on with the assumption that supply chain is not an issue. And so as countries, we really have to produce tier-based advice for healthcare workers. And of course, in that space is where I feel the rules and responsibilities is kind of an important aspect. I think documenting and sharing really publicly what, if any of the industrial partners that are engaged, it's extremely important for raw data to be shared. For example, the hard reality that Arnab and I have faced in the testing world is there is a lot of material that's available, but their actual data is not available. So we have to replicate the entire thing again. And if industrial partners that are engaged, that are producing products that are alternative, if their raw data was available, it would have been much easier to really build guidelines on that because we would have a sense of trust in. But much of that raw data is often enough not shared for all kinds of reasons. I mean, even getting data on 3M masks is actually extremely difficult. They're only given for a certain flow settings. And again, I'm sure much more testing is done, but then it's kept private. And maybe for medical care and clinical care, we need to have standards where the raw data is shared as well. Yeah, I mean, you can see I'm trying to skirt this. I don't really have an answer to this. I think this is going to be a policy question beyond this crisis where regulatory bodies might have a specific guidelines on crisis mode.
So let's get back to something, more down to your devices. So there are a bunch of questions on the Pufferfish ventilator. And one of these is, again, a more philosophical question, but the more interesting one. If you can make a ventilator for so cheap compared to the standard hospital ventilator, why aren't more of these devices prevalent in normal times, apart from the like special times like this? Do you envision a time where these devices also are widespread in hospitals rather than the fancy expensive ones?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been the mission of the lab per se, of the philosophy of frugal science, is that step by step, we really have to look at medical care and instrumentations used in medical care and redesign them for access. Currently, the incentives, the financial incentives have not existed to create accessible medical healthcare, honestly. I think, it's, of course, there's a lot of effort, but thinking about there is a massive space in being able to engineer at highest quality and at cost. And again, what I described was the bill of materials. There are logistics concern. I mean, to run an operation that allows to provide a healthcare instrument to a market with the kind of service and the kind of training associated with many of these instruments. Of course, certain costs will vary. But I would argue that this crisis is going to teach us something about a new movement in medical devices, especially critical care medical devices that will have a renaissance. I mean, literally one of the goals for us was none of the reference designs for these exist. I mean, some of the designs have been out there in publications, but no actual design exists that could be replicated by somebody else. I mean, many of you have seen the data that was shared by Medtronic, and it's almost like a 2,000, 5,000 page manual, but it doesn't even have the bill of materials. So the goal that we are thinking of playing first is to set up for every possible medical device that you can imagine reference designs. And then, of course, keep the clinical validation at a level where you can truly test each one of these sets of devices or ideas before they could be implemented. So I definitely feel that we are going to see a different world in a medical device context post this crisis. And I think the goal has always been is, of course, we are building for this crisis now. But the reason we chose to not go down the path of these automated ambu bags was really that we want to actually build a device that will be approved by the FDA for normal use in normal times, because this would have a longevity. And again, it's extremely important that, for what is being used by patients, that you can provide the highest level of care. And that part is, I think, even though we're in crisis mode, that part is essential.
And for many of your things, you've tried to use standard components that are in quotes widely available. One of the things is, how do you decide something is actually going to be easily available across the world, wherever you do it?
Yeah, so that happened by a lot of research with our partners. So literally, while deciding the bill of materials, we had the engineers in India, Bangladesh, Kenya, Chile, all try to get that same part and ensure and confirm that, yes, this is the part availability because of this route. Of course, they all use different routes, but this has been one of the perspectives of thinking about standard parts, is to just, the goal is we cannot scale up the need that's needed. So I think partnership was an essential component of every one of these projects. So I think letting go of the ownership has been very important in that sense, because now once we have the partners, they are also actively solving this problem from a local context. We've been thinking about this notion, and this is a little bit of a tricky notion of thinking about modularity in medical devices. In some sense, modularity is very helpful, because then if in a given location, this part is just not accessible, here is a second modular part. The challenge comes in the regulatory side. You cannot get a modular device approved by a regulatory process. You can only get one device approved. So I think there's a little bit of a challenge there. And so, of course, this is why our focus has been on getting regulatory approvals in local settings as well, so that the local partners are implementing for the instrument that's being put together by them to the regulatory local bodies there, so that there is some connection directly, rather than this one thing that's approved somewhere else and then shared across the world. I mean, for example, in Kenya, when we just spoke to the teams in Kenya, the battery life that we were assuming that we want to put for Pufferfish for it to operate without electricity, they said that's just not sufficient because we have blackouts and brownouts so much more often, and you have to push that limit. And so then a modular component was added that allows us a battery life that's much longer. But without that interaction, we would, even though we think about this, but without that direct demand, we would not have implemented that feature, for example.
Okay, I see we have 6 more minutes of Q&A time. So let's move to the new mask, the scuba gear modified mask. So questions are about, how do you make it reusable? Can you sterilize it many times? How are you sure that there's no residual contamination because of all the nooks and crannies it has? And there are a whole variation of questions on this theme, essentially. So the reusability of the mask.
Yeah, so I think the goal of, if some of you have read through or looked through the literature for elastomeric respirators, that's really where the inspiration comes from. Many companies that actually make these scuba masks also make gas masks and elastomeric respirators, ironically. So they're made from very similar molds and designs and similar materials. There are 2 or 3 decontamination methods that are accessible, and many of them are liquid-based methods with a bleach solution. So the mask is actually dipped in that and left there for some time. That takes care of the nooks and crannies, and then it's dried out. There are these wipes that are accessible by 3M that are primarily for elastomeric cleaning. And one of the things about reusability is that these are masks that are built for long periods of time. And some of these types of instruments are used in other hazardous conditions in which they get a far higher wear and tear as compared to the kind of air that you would see in a medical space. The context that's tricky in implementation of this is actually not the mask or the coupler, it's the filter. Because you have to choose the filter carefully and well. And one of the aspects of these filters is that they have a lifetime that's far longer because they are used on a patient on a continuous basis, even for 2 weeks, for example. And so we are running and kind of also applying for FDA EUA with the filter manufacturers for long-term use of these filters, because in the past because there was no need, they were never actually approved for long-term use. But one of the contexts that has come about from this is the choice of the filters is critical. And so on the site, if you go to NewMask's website, we provide a very long list of filters that we have directly tested or we have raw data for that we recommend. And on the masks front, I think it's also important to note that not all masks are made equal. So we have tried to validate a certain number of masks, and there are 3 or 4 masks that we're very confident in. But there might be other masks in the market that might not show the same kind of a sealing performance. Because of just in the sports world, our partnership with these organizations gave us all the raw data for how these masks are made and what materials they're used. We did an extensive amount of decontamination studies on them, and that was what was shared in the EUA that was submitted to the French Health Ministry. And I think it was primarily because of the partnership of a mask manufacturer that we had all the raw data. We didn't have to reinvent the wheel for what is this seal made out of, what are the health effects associated with it. We really knew what material the masks are made out of.
Okay, here's something which is not probably directly concerned with the decontamination, but maybe you have some views on this. N95 masks are actually being worn by healthcare workers for very extended periods of time. And, one of the difficulties is the breathability. So, is there any solution to make a N95 mask something which filters very well, but is also, easy to breathe in for a long time, carbon dioxide accumulation and things like that?
Yeah, no, I think, that's a fantastic question, because I think this is why I feel we really have to approach is there are no one answers. The ease of use of N95, and I think there's several elastomeric respirator researchers we've been talking to where they say just the fact that you can have a pack of them just sitting that you could grab quickly, get ready, because in an emergency situation when you have to do donning and doffing, the ease of use of N95s is phenomenal. I think the question that I would think about on the scientific side is that phase space plot that I showed. I'm actually genuinely very excited about it because it has the capacity of being able to provide tunability, and the certain set of breathability that's accessible at this point is primarily one of the target, but there is nothing fundamental in that to be able to say that, oh, you cannot improve the breathability further. I think one of the things that we have found surprising is much of the literature in this is hidden in patents. So when we look through the charging processes, for example, for N95, and even some of the manufacturing processes, we find some of that is either trade secrets or hidden in patents where the complete process is not given, or somebody has invented the process, it's patented, it works, but nobody knows why. One idea that we've been tackling with for some of the scientists in this group would be is hydrocharging. There are several sets of patents on using liquid aerosol droplets to cause charging, but actually the mechanism of that, I cannot, as yet, we are grappling with it. And so I think there is a massive room of improvement in also just doing fundamental science on this sets of applied problems. And out of that would come out, if we can improve the breathability by even twofold, that would make a huge difference. I think, of course, the fit is a huge issue. When you watch the picture of a COVID healthcare worker with, bruise marks on their nose, that's the reality. That's not comfortable as well if you're going to put the same mask over and over again every day at the same bridge point. And I think there's some very clever ideas that are being explored in that space. And this is why maybe a hybrid of an elastomeric and an N95 might be the elastomeric seal that allows you to have a seal which is comfortable, while a replaceable filter that allows you to have a much more of a ready supply of a half mask. I think the sky is the limit in terms of thinking about this, but I think one of the challenge has to be that cost has to be part of the equation. Because cost in the past has not been, regular N95 itself is also fairly expensive. If you're going to be in a COVID world for a long period of time, a dramatic cost reduction in N95 would actually be a phenomenal step forward.
Okay, so we are sort of out of time, but there is this one question that I really, really want to take, and I've saved this for the end. So probably we'll take this as the last question. Which is,
and then if you can send me the list of questions, I would love to read them anyway, even if I was not able to answer. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so, your solutions have come from inspirations like a cotton candy machine. Earlier, you had a yo-yo for the, what is it, the whirligig machine.
The centrifuge,
Centrifuge, it had a better name, right? The paperfuge, the paperfuge, yeah. So how do you come up with these, cheap, innovative, cool ideas to use in solutions like this? So what is the essence of the Manu method of frugal innovation?
Yeah, there's nothing other than, I think, having a filing system in your head. I think the history of the cotton candy machine is 6 years ago. You can go on Microcosmos, the Foldscope website. I had imaged cotton candy under a Foldscope, and I had noticed something that I found surprising, which was just the variation in polydispersity of these fibers in the regular cotton candy. And I was just puzzled by it. There are several sets of objects. And then, I just filed that in the back of my head. And when I was starting to think about the challenge for N95, it just connected to the fact that, of course, there are many methods that are used to make microscale fibrous materials. They just didn't have the throughput. And it turned out just the physics of centrifugation is such that you can actually scale up the process. So the connection for this specific one was just, historically, whenever I'm working or playing, I don't make any distinction between applied science and basic science. And actually, frankly, here is a great way of thinking about this, that we often think, and again, in a crisis mode, you might think governments wanting to now shift their grants to much more applied work while the basic work might suffer. And because they have to make all these budgetary decisions at this moment. And at the heart of this is often enough that out in the whimsical, if for that lack of better word, sets of ideas are phenomenal solutions. And I value this because we do both of these in the same lab. I often, when I'm talking to people, I think collaborations are very important, but for origins of ideas, you also have to have two parts of your brain thinking about applied and basic problems at the same time. Sometimes that's actually extremely valuable because then you are the person who can make the connection between those two things simultaneously. But I think just personally for me, I have a filing system for whenever there is a curious phenomena, you at least need to understand it enough. Then the next time that you're going to need it, you know that it's the appropriate method. And I think, just although we're in a crisis mode, play is still the most important inspiration for ideas. And I think we find it playful. I don't know if you saw that one picture of a graduate student with the Van de Graaff machine. When we brought that machine in, everybody had their picture taken before they connected it. And, just we all know this as scientists, but I think it's not widely known that play is at the heart of. Arnab, your setup when I read your paper with the plastic ball as a mannequin, it all comes from play. And it's extremely important that we keep that alive even in these times of crisis.
Great. I think that's a fantastic note to end with. Thank you so much, Manu. It was a pleasure learning from all your little play that's happening in your lab. And we hope to see many more things come out of it in the near future for COVID, as well as on a long term as we go along. Okay, with that, thank you all for listening on YouTube and Zoom. Remember, this video will be up, and do keep watching it and send in your questions. We'll try and answer them as best as we can. So with this, over to you, back to Chandrakant to take care of the logistics.
Okay. Thank you everyone for attending. As Professor Arnab said, the video will be up on YouTube. We will also be posting it on the COVIDGyan website very, very quickly. Thank you, Dr. Manu Prakash, for a very inspirational talk. And with that, we will be signing off, and I'm ending the webinar right now. Goodbye, Manu.
Bye, everybody.